tonight, we're not talking about kings who built castles or emperors who declared war on the sea. Tonight, we're talking about the final act, the moment when history's characters made their last exit, sometimes with dignity, sometimes with tragedy, and sometimes in ways so ridiculous you almost want to laugh, even as you shiver. Because death is supposed to be solemn, poetic even. The warrior falling in battle, the saint passing away in prayer, the old philosopher closing his eyes after a long life. But history is rarely that neat. Sometimes death barges in, like a drunk guest at a banquet, toppling plates and knocking over candles. Sometimes it's not noble at all, but absurd. And those are the stories we're here for tonight. The ridiculous deaths, the ones that make you shake your head and wonder how reality can be so careless, so ironic, so strange. And nowhere is that clearer than with our first story, the tale of Draco, the Athenian lawgiver. Draco lived in the 7th century BCE, a time when Athens was still finding its way as a city-state. He was famous, or infamous, for writing laws so harsh that even minor crimes were punishable by death. In fact, the very word draconian comes from his name. You might expect a man like that to die in some grim, stern fashion, perhaps assassinated by angry citizens, or cut down in a riot. But no, Draco's end was stranger than that. One day he was giving a speech in the theater at Aegina. The crowd adored him, or at least respected him enough to honor him in the traditional way, by throwing cloaks and hats and robes onto him as tokens of affection. It was like showering a modern celebrity with flowers, except heavier, much heavier. Because as the crowd tossed their garments, the pile grew higher and higher until Draco was buried beneath it, smothered to death by cloaks, swallowed alive by the affection of his supporters. Imagine that. A man so feared for his harsh laws, so associated with severity, suffocated not by rebellion, not by hatred, but by love. One moment, he's basking in applause. The next, he's gasping for air under a mountain of wool. It's tragic, yes, but also absurd, like a cosmic joke written by a playwright with a twisted sense of humor. And yet, Draco was not the only one to die in such ridiculous fashion. Centuries later, another philosopher, Chrysippus of Soli, met an end that was equally strange, though far funnier. Chrysippus was a Stoic philosopher, one of those men who built entire systems of thought around reason, self-control, and the pursuit of virtue. The Stoics taught that emotions should not overwhelm us, that we should meet life and death with calm detachment. And Chrysippus himself was respected, a man of sharp wit and deep intellect. But death did not come to him in solemn silence. It came in laughter. According to ancient sources, Chrysippus was watching a donkey eat figs one day. Amused, he told a servant to give the donkey some wine as well to wash them down. The sight struck him as so hilarious, so absurd, that he began to laugh uncontrollably. And then, still laughing, he died. A Stoic philosopher, dead of laughter at a drunken donkey. Think about that for a moment. A man who spent his life teaching others how to control their passions, how to face existence with reason and calm, undone by a fit of giggles. His disciples must have stood there stunned, wondering whether to weep or to laugh along with him. The irony is too sharp to miss. Death, it seems, has a sense of timing worthy of a comedian. Now pause for a second. Picture these scenes. The lawgiver buried under cloaks, the philosopher felled by laughter. Imagine if either of these were your final moments. Your family, your friends, the chroniclers of your time, all writing down your grand achievements, only to tack on at the end. And then he was, smothered by robes, and then he laughed himself to death at a donkey. It makes you realize how fragile legacy can be, because history doesn't always remember us for what we lived for. Sometimes it remembers us for how we died. And sometimes those deaths are ridiculous enough to eclipse everything else. The torches flicker against damp stone. You can smell the musk of straw, the faint metallic tang of iron shackles, the lingering odor of sweat and fear. It's not a battlefield or a throne room you're standing in, but a prison cell, because not every king dies on a throne. Some end their reigns in places meant for thieves and traitors, and Edward II of England was one of them. Edward's story is one of the strangest in English history, not only because of how he lived, but because of how he died. Born in 1284, he was the son of Edward I, a king so fierce he was nicknamed Longshanks. His father was a conqueror, a man who fought wars in Wales and Scotland, a giant in both stature and reputation. And then came Edward II, a son who inherited the throne but not the strength. From the start, Edward seemed different. He wasn't interested in war or politics. He preferred rowing boats, digging ditches, hanging out with commoners, and, most controversially, spending his time with a man named Piers Gaveston. Gaveston was charming, flashy, and deeply unpopular with the nobility, who saw him as a bad influence. But Edward adored him. He lavished him with titles, gifts, and lands, making enemies at every turn. The barons of England grew furious. They demanded Gaveston's removal, but Edward refused. Civil strife brewed. Eventually, Gaveston was captured by rebellious nobles and executed. Edward was devastated, but he didn't learn. He took new favorites, Hugh Despenser chief among them, and showered them with the same kind of obsessive affection. Once again, the nobility seethed. The result was disaster. Rebellion flared. Edward's wife, Isabella of France, known as the She-Wolf, joined forces with her lover Roger Mortimer and raised an army against him. In 1327, Edward was captured, forced to abdicate in favor of his young son, and imprisoned. A king who once ruled England now sat in a cold cell, his crown replaced by humiliation. And then came his death. Now, here's where history blurs into legend. According to chroniclers writing decades later, Edward was murdered in a way so grotesque, so humiliating, that it echoed through time with a red-hot poker. They say his captors, eager to avoid visible wounds that might suggest foul play, held him down and inserted a heated iron rod into his body, burning him from within. His screams could be heard beyond the castle walls. Imagine that for a moment. A king, once crowned with gold, ending his life in such indignity. Not on the battlefield, not in solemn sickness, but in a manner designed to be both painful and obscene. It's so absurdly cruel, so grotesquely symbolic, that historians still debate whether it really happened. Was it true? Some argue yes, that his enemies wanted him destroyed, not just physically, but in memory, forever branded with humiliation. Others say no, that the story was invented later, propaganda meant to blacken his name and justify the rebellion. Some even claim Edward escaped, living out his days in obscurity, a forgotten king wandering Europe. But whether the poker story is true or not, it became his legend. When people hear the name Edward II, they don't think of his policies or his struggles. They think of his death, ridiculous, grotesque, and unforgettable. The final act of a king, whose reign was marked not by power, but by weakness, obsession, and betrayal. And here's the strange part. Edward wasn't alone in dying an absurd royal death. The Middle Ages were rife with such endings. Take, for example, Sigurd the Mighty, a 9th century Viking Earl of Orkney. After defeating an enemy in battle, Sigurd strapped the man's severed head to his saddle as a trophy. But as he rode home, the head's teeth grazed his leg, cutting the skin. The wound festered, turned septic, and killed him. Imagine that. A warrior who survived countless battles, slain not by swords or spears, but by a dead man's tooth. These stories remind us that death doesn't always match life. You can be a conqueror, a philosopher, a king, and yet your end can come from a tooth, a chair, or a whispered rumor twisted into legend. Now, picture yourself in medieval England, hearing the news of Edward II's death. Maybe you believe the poker story, maybe you don't. But either way, you shake your head, mutter a prayer, and get back to your daily struggle for bread and warmth. Because in the end, kings may die ridiculously, but life goes on. And that's the lesson threaded through these stories. Death is universal. It comes for everyone: kings, philosophers, farmers, warriors. And sometimes it comes with irony sharp enough to cut deeper than any sword.